Good evening. Welcome to the Pearl Report. I'm Diana Lin. Every 10 hours, someone commits suicide in Hong Kong. For those who've lost their loved ones to suicide, experts say there's rarely any closure. As producer Sylvia Yu reports, these suicide bereaved suffer from a more complicated grief than other death survivors.
Brad and Carol Jordan moved to Hong Kong from the United States 29 years ago. They both work for nonprofit organizations. Over the years, they raised 4 children, 2 adopted. Their second son attended Shatton College before going to a university in Chicago in 2002 to major in engineering.
He was really actively engaged. Lots of friends, on the rugby team, in a fraternity, involved in many clubs, working as a student advisor at school.
Brad and Carol say Caleb was a natural leader.
Caleb was a giver. One of the ways he expressed friendship was in giving gifts. He was 12 or 13. He told us he felt he wanted to go to Africa and work in music. He was a very passionate person.
He was very into people, very into kids.
Caleb volunteered as a counselor at summer camps in Hong Kong for several years.
Actually, when Caleb would come home from college, like at Christmas for the break,
He would bring laughter.
yeah. When he walked in the door, it was like the celebration began.
Then in his 4th year, we got a phone call from the local police saying that he'd been found dead in his dorm room.
The police said it was a suicide death. Caleb was 21.
It's like our world stopped at that time. And one of the hardest things was to have to tell Carol about this.
I was at this women's retreat, and when Brad came in, the first thing I thought of was my mom, because my mom was over 80 years old and she was staying with us at the time. To everyone around him and for us, it was a total shock.
Because he was so happy and so engaged, and there was no warning that there was any inner turmoil or struggle.
The family members will feel guilty of not being able to detect the signs or may not be able to do anything to prevent it. So that makes it a little bit complicated.
It's extremely hard to prevent because they are not professionals. Most suicides are impulsive.
For someone who died, they can't choose the timing. But for those who commit suicide, they choose the timing. So to the bereaved person, it seems like it is a rejection or abandonment.
Ultimately, all people are potentially at risk of suicide, whether the losses of those we love, the losses of identity-defining careers or social roles, losses of health. We may find ourselves on the brink of self-destruction.
Nearly 1 million people die of suicide globally each year.
The World Health Organization have said that suicide is an international epidemic. More people die from suicide than all wars and homicides put together.
There's a close association between economic factors and suicide rate. Men has a rate about 2 times higher than women, probably because that men are less likely to seek help, more likely to have drug or alcohol problems, which are also major risk factors for suicide.
Men tend to use more violent methods and therefore more successful than women.
Also, the elderly population have the highest suicide rate compared to other age groups.
They think they are fragile and they bring burden to their family members.
845 people committed suicide in Hong Kong in 2012.
In Hong Kong, we have an average of 3 suicides a day, although the suicide rate has fallen.
Due to public health changes and more suicide prevention hotlines.
Hong Kong is still among the top 3 in Asia for suicide numbers.
Behind South Korea and Japan. Researchers say at least 60 people are affected by each suicide.
Including the family members and the co-workers or the students or classmates there will be about 48 million people impacted by suicide per year.
These things make the whole community feel sad. And this is what we call vicarious traumatization.
Cece helped organize a global conference on grief and bereavement in Hong Kong this past May.
Grief is something that we will all experience some point in our lifetime, starting from the pet's death to loved ones leaving, or high conflict family relationships and suicides.
Brad and Carol are both 58. When they arrived in Hong Kong, their sons Matthew was 3, Caleb 8 months old. Years later, the Jordans adopted 2 more kids, Sam and Sophie. Brad says he was washing windows at their home on November 4th, 2005, when the police called about Caleb's death.
Every time I wash windows at our home, it takes me back to that afternoon. It's painful as years go by. It's not as deep and fresh.
There can be so many questions. There can be shame.
There's a sense of failure as a parent. You have all these aspirations, and you raise up your child. If they fall, they can pick themselves up again. This is the end.
The failing feeling applies to particularly parents, because children are still under the guidance of the parents, and these will easily lead to the parents to think that they are failing their children.
The Jordans spoke with family and Caleb's friends to find answers. Caleb had surgery on his arm after a rugby game injury.
He had strong pain medication as a result of that surgery, and he was kind of struggling with where he was and who he was, and he was drinking a lot. And so it was a combination of all of those factors coming together, and he gave up.
In the end, the only way to really move forward is to let go of the things that we don't have answers for.
Oh, yeah.
Since Caleb's death, Carol and her friend Bin Bin have met once a week.
Grief, especially a complicated grief, is easier to bear when it's shared with other people that we trust. They know everything about the situation, and you're still good friends.
Really?
The shame and the stigma are removed from that completely.
I also have depression at that time. Carol here helped me on healing my old problem.
A friend of Carol's, someone that Carol's kind of met with regularly over the last number of years.
Brad and Carol also find solace in support groups, such as the one at the Samaritans, an NGO that helps suicide bereaved.
We quit holding the pain in, and it opens us up to others around us who are able to carry us. But now I thought...
Alistair is a volunteer who leads a support group.
There is stigma. The importance of talking to people who do understand is what we offer.
To share my experience in the loss of my son with someone else that has a common experience, there's a complete openness. It's very healing.
Why the Samaritan?
The Samaritans runs a 24-hour multilingual suicide prevention hotline that gets at least 80 calls a day.
What we need in Hong Kong to make a bigger difference is more community support for suicide survivors, more understanding and more counselling facilities.
The government, the hospital authority, and the social welfare department offer generic family support services, but there is no specialist unit in the public service, particularly for bereavement. It is very important that the government would consider enhancing its services.
Brad and Carol visit Caleb's grave in Pok Fu Lam at least once a year.
It's a place that we can come and think back on Caleb's life. We had 21 great, fabulous years with Caleb. And so it's so important not to let the end wipe out the 21 years before that.
Ling is 46. In the fall of 2005, Ling went to her ex-husband's apartment to look for him when he didn't answer his phone.
A man outside told me something has happened, and then I collapsed.
She was told Ah Chi killed himself a week earlier.
The last relative he saw was me. Then he bought charcoal in the supermarket and killed himself.
Ling blamed herself for his suicide.
I'm guilty. My biggest feeling is fear. You don't feel scared like this if a family member died from illness. I was so worried and scared, and the feeling continued for years. It was really complicated.
If it is a sudden thing happened to her, she will feel her life loss of control, and that will be generalized into other forms of fear in other aspects of her life.
Such as fear of losing other family members, fear of losing one's job.
Why did he abandon me and my daughter?
Ling and Ah Chi's daughter was 13 at the time of his suicide. She says Ah Chi was addicted to heroin, and that broke up their 5-year marriage, but they remained friends.
Why no suicide note? He loved his daughter so much, it's impossible not to leave a note. Not one last word. I was so angry.
She is angry at the ex-husband of not asking for help and seems not trusting her to have the ability to support. So the anger can be a source that hurts, that's complicated grief.
Ling says she had suicidal thoughts.
I really wanted to follow him.
Suicide has a traumatic impact on the society as a whole, on the family as well. Because for each suicide, it has been estimated that there were around 10 to 20 suicide attempts.
A focus on suicide bereavement can be understood as prevention of suicide in the next circle of survivors, as it is a way of attending to their despair that does not tend to characterize other losses to illness or even other violent means.
Ling says she felt lost until she learned of suicide prevention services and joined its support group for suicide bereaved. After 2 years of counseling, she became a group leader.
I kept asking why, but I stopped asking when I joined the group. Because everyone else is asking too, and we all understand each other. Sharing our joy and our grief is very important. Walking outdoors really helps me to relax and release me from fear and difficulties. Initially, I felt very lonely. I had to take care of my daughter and walk that path alone. At first, I thought we'd do this together, but he died. Raising my daughter on my own has made me much stronger and more independent, even though it's not what I wanted.
Coming up, a suicidal survivor says the government ignored his cry for help.
It might take 2 to 3 weeks to arrange for me to see a psychiatrist. It was an emergency.
An NGO reaches suicide bereaved at public mortuaries.
We've got around 30 new cases in a month.
More on that when we return. Stay with us.